All right. Hello. Thank you for tuning in wherever you are in the world for this session of Veterans Advanced Energy Week. I hope you're able to join us for that last session on the post-pandemic green recovery and clean energy economic opportunities. It's such an important conversation to be having right now, especially. So my name is Julia Piper, and I am your moderator for this next session. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center and host and producer of Political Climate, a bipartisan podcast on energy and environmental issues in America. I'm also vice president of communication and policy for GoodLeap, which is the nation's leading financier of sustainable home solutions, and we are proud to be a Vets Energy Week partner this year. I'm now pleased to introduce Congresswoman and Army veteran Mariannette Miller-Meeks, who joins us, who represents, Iowa's 2nd Congressional District. We're going to have a dynamic fireside chat. So first, hello, Congresswoman. I hope you're doing well.
Doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Well, before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes from me. This event is on the record. We're also live streaming on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you, everyone listening, to post about what you hear today, share it on social media. You can use the hashtag Vets Energy Week and tag the Atlantic Council at AC Global Energy, as well as Vets_Energy to include the Veterans Advanced Energy Project there. If you would like to participate in the conversation and submit questions, we encourage you to do it through the Q&A portal as part of the Zoom screen at the bottom there. You can do that anytime during the event, and we will incorporate those Q&A questions as we go through. Do note, though, that the Q&A access is only available to those engaging with the event through the Veterans Advanced Energy app, and that's where you'll be able to submit the questions. Now, I am again so glad to turn to Representative Miller-Meeks. For a bit of background, she enlisted in the Army at 18, where she served for 24 years as a private, a nurse, and a doctor. She went on into private practice in Ottumwa, Iowa in 1997, and has remained there ever since with her husband, Kurt. She has a father who is a master sergeant in the U.S. Air Force. And I know from her bio that both of her parents worked incredibly hard, sometimes taking multiple jobs to support their family. And since then, I know that Representative Miller-Meeks has gone on to ensure that veterans in America all across the country have had the support they need as they transition into other areas of the workforce. So we will get into that. First, I'd like to hand it over to her for some opening remarks. Congresswoman.
Well, thank you so much, Julia. And I just want to say what an honor it is for me to be able to speak with you all today. Especially given that most of our audience are veterans. And I consider my military service one of the most valuable experiences in my lifetime. It's also where I happened to meet my husband, Kurt, who is also a military veteran. And we met at Walter Reed there in Washington, D.C., and he got an Article 15 for dating me. So I guess he thought that this was going to be a challenging experience with an Army nurse, and so he buckled in for the ride. I have no idea what he would have done if the Army would have decided to bust him a stripe. Every day, hundreds of our military service members who have valiantly served our country retire from the armed services, or they leave active duty and begin their search for civilian employment. Right now, there are approximately 1 million unemployed military veterans across the United States. And as a 24-year Army veteran, I know the unique skill sets and qualities that veterans bring to the table and why hiring them is an excellent decision. There are very few professions that are as laser focused on goal completion as the military. From day one of basic training, we're taught the importance of completing the mission as efficiently and as effectively as possible. We are trained to enhance our own individual talents while enabling us to work in groups, large and small, to complete our stated objectives. As most of our military members know, slacking off or taking things easy is not an option. Each task that you have been individually been assigned must be completed for a reason, and we understand that the individual task is part of a larger jigsaw puzzle and is mission critical. Each piece is there for a reason, and each piece must fit to ensure the completion of the larger goal or mission. Military personnel are also taught to be relentless in achieving their goals, and this can help your team show more initiative to complete the task at hand and the forethought to recognize unintended roadblocks or consequences of an individual action and its impact on the team and mission. One thing that we all know veterans understand is national security. And not many things are as important to U.S. national security as low-cost energy resources in abundance, energy safety, and energy independence. Easily accessible and inexpensive energy is essential to a functioning economy and a sovereign nation. The increased connectivity of our world has led to more access to energy and greater energy demands, but also to energy vulnerabilities. Threats to our energy security come in many forms: political instability in energy producing regions, manipulation of the energy supply, competition over energy sources, attacks on our supply infrastructure, over reliance on foreign nations, natural disasters, and terrorism, including cyber terrorism, as we recently saw. Fortunately, there are many ways to increase our long-term energy security: reducing dependence on any one source of imported energy, increasing the number of suppliers, using resources found in the United States, of which we have abundant natural resources, and improving energy conservation. Our country has taken amazing steps in recent decades towards energy independence, and I believe our veterans are the perfect personnel to continue this trajectory. Meeting the ever-increasing energy demands will call for emerging generation technologies such as biogas, wind, community solar, and more distributed resources, coupled with increased investments in transmission infrastructure and more collaboration between grid operators for energy upgrade, will bring a more resilient and reliable, especially in the face of natural disasters. Our veterans and military have already been active in the microgrid space and can bring this experience into the macrogrid space, which needs to be updated and modernized. We also need to assess the democratization of energy production and self-generation as the demands that it places on the infrastructure. Our focus cannot be only on the most popular renewable energy sources such as wind and solar, but we must also continue research and development into the energy of the future, continued research and investment in small nuclear reactors and newer materials such as thorium, hydrogen fuel cells, and continued research and development into battery storage so that we can have a continual base load and diversity of energy sources, and that must be assured. Energy infrastructure is a central component of day-to-day life in America. To remain safe and competitive, critical updates must be made, including an efficient, all of the above energy strategy and approach that makes the most of our country's diverse renewable assets, and that should be required. Congress will continue having challenging conversations about what recovery and investing in infrastructure looks like and the roles veterans can play. As we look at reducing our carbon footprint globally, we must also understand the environmental impact of our renewable energy sources. Rather than waiting to address the impact of wind turbines, wind blades, solar panels, the mining for rare earth elements in countries with poor environmental practices and slave labor, we should address these issues as part of our overall energy strategy. We should learn from the lack of insight as the information age took off and we had landfills full of desktop computers and we outsourced the retrieval of critical metals and elements to other people of developing nations. In our quest for renewable energy sources and reduction of our carbon footprint, we must also simultaneously address the environmental impact of the end products, given their lifespan, and do so in an ethical and environmentally sound manner. Just as we have done in Iowa with our home-based Iowa initiative that was started under our Governor, now Ambassador Branstad, I feel that our veterans are ideally suited with their attention to detail, continually fine-tuning of their individual skills and talents, and how we can integrate those talents into a team approach of completing the mission. In my humble opinion, whether a veteran has an advanced degree, training within the military, on-the-job experience, or education and training in another field, there is still no one better suited or qualified to take the United States into a global leadership position on energy independence, energy security, and pragmatic climate change solutions that will continue to allow our economy to grow. Our U.S. veterans have sacrificed so much for our country and have proved that they are among the most dedicated, talented, and hardworking Americans in the job market. And just as we found with Home-Based Iowa Initiative, hiring veterans is a win-win-win for employers, communities, and veterans. Thank you all so much for your service, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to address you on your 5th annual meeting.
Fantastic. Okay, I feel like there's so much I want to unpack and speak with you further about in those opening remarks. I'd like to start with keeping with the focus of employment, especially among veterans. In May, you introduced the bipartisan VR&E NEED Act, which would ensure disabled veterans get the support they need to enter the civilian workforce through the VA's Veteran Readiness and Employment Program. So tell us a little bit more about this legislation and where it stands today.
And so this was legislation that Representative Mickey Sherrill and I introduced, and it was a two-part component. One was the GI Need Act, and then the VRNE Need Act. So those components were, as you know, through the pandemic, many universities or programs were shut down and they were closed. Well, if you're a veteran and you have your GI Bill, it's time limited. So the time limit may expire while you're in this pause from your educational system. So a veteran, through no fault of their own, would have been able to complete their educational degree. Both of us thought that this was unfair. It was an unfair practice and it needed to be addressed, but it needed to be addressed through legislation and congressional action. So we introduced the GI Need Act and the VRNE Need Act, which is for disabled veterans, so that if through no fault of their own, through a national emergency, a pandemic, there was a pause in their education and they could not complete their degree program, that their veterans benefits would also, GI Bill benefits would also pause, and then they could be resumed and the expiration date could be extended. So I think it's a very important piece of legislation. It's passed through the House and waiting for it to pass in the Senate.
I see. Okay, great. Yeah, there's so many elements, I think, to like expanding the workforce as we're learning through the course of these discussions today. And clearly that is one of them. So I'd love to also get a little bit of more of your own personal story here, since you are also, you served in the military. And so I'd love to know a little bit more about why you decided to join, and honestly, how you made the transition yourself into other areas of the workforce. And now, being an elected official, elected politician, how did you navigate those transitions yourself, having also served?
Well, for one thing, my father was in the military. So we traveled from military base to military base with my father, who is a Master Sergeant in the Air Force. And interestingly enough, he worked in the nuclear power sphere, even though he wasn't an engineer. So both in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and then shut down a nuclear power plant in Sundance, Wyoming. And so I was very familiar with the military. My two older brothers, I'm one of 8 kids, I'm the 4th. My two older brothers went into the military. And so for me, in trying to become a doctor when no one in my family had had a college education, I looked at what was available to me and how I was going to navigate that. And so I left home at 16, started at San Antonio Junior College, or San Antonio College as it's now known, and decided to enlist in the military because I knew that would help me advance my education. And I was very comfortable with military service and military personnel. I was comfortable with military bases. As a matter of fact, when I made the transition to civilian life, I wasn't really sure where to shop for groceries because I'd been shopping at the commissary almost my entire life with my parents. So it was very comfortable for me and an avenue where I knew that I could continue to increase my education, get training in the military, and that the military was a place where, it's very, it's a meritocracy, so that you could continue to enhance your skills, that education and further education was something that's desirable in the military and was never an impediment. So I was very comfortable in pursuing military at the same time as I was pursuing my other educational options.
And so I guess with that experience, what advice would you have to veterans today who are now looking at joining, say, the advanced energy sector, either perhaps on a personal note or even as you look at the sector itself, coming from a big energy state? What are the opportunities you see? Where do you see the inroads and new places for veterans to start looking for work in that sector should they want to?
So first of all, there's existing opportunities in that sector. So be they in wind or solar, even in my congressional district, there's a town that's 25 miles from me that has 3 solar installations. And they have done massive projects. They're also working on battery storage. And so there's a lot of opportunities in that field, I think, as we continue to look at more renewable sources of energy. Certainly, if you're in the ag sector or ag and energy sector, there are opportunities in the ag and energy sector, as we've seen with biodiesel, with ethanol, but also beyond that in the agricultural sector with carbon capture and biochar. So those are things that within Iowa, we're really on the forefront on, and there's funding for that, grants for that at the Iowa State University. So there's opportunities in the ag energy sector. There's opportunities in, it's going to sound crazy, but in manure and energy production from manure. And so there's opportunities in agriculture, there's opportunities in installation, and there's also opportunities in energy development. So I think one thing that gets lost as we talk about energy infrastructure is what already happens in the military and happens at the Argonne National Lab, at the other EPA laboratories that exist around the country. And I think we focus on wind and solar, but we don't focus on battery storage and the need for a continual base load. We're losing some of our engineering capacity in nuclear, and that's very concerning to me. We had a nuclear power plant north of here in Iowa in Cedar Rapids, Palo Alto, not Palo Alto, but it's the Duane Arnold in Iowa, and it was closed down a year ago, but had been there for 40 years, had never had an incident, was one of the cleanest places I've ever gone to. So we should continue research and development. So if you're into research and development, if you're more on that science nerdy side, or if you're looking for employment opportunities, I think that there are a lot of opportunities available in this sphere. And then also we have to look at, as I mentioned in my opening speech, what do we do and how do we process renewable energy resources? We know that solar panels have a finite lifespan. You have to recover certain critical metals from them, the rare earth elements. And this also applies to wind turbines. So whether it's energy waste management, this is something that we should have forethought and insight into what we're going to do as we go into the future, and how do we do that in an environmentally sound pattern. So I think there's a lot of opportunity available, and I don't think there's anybody better to do it than the military. One of the bills that we introduced this year was the Vet Tech bill, which is a bill that has 6 months of training. It's a grant program in data and technology for veterans. So it's a new program that we increased the funding on it. It's only been around 18 months, but has been very active in getting veterans employed with very good average incomes.
All right, lots of opportunities there. We'll probably circle back on those some more. Actually, one question that sort of stems from one we already got from the audience is how you view supporting domestic manufacturing of solar products, solar panels, say, and treating it so that there's the ability for more companies in the U.S. to grow those companies and hire veterans through them. Do you have a perspective on that?
So most of the, I think, attention has been on solar installation and tax credits that allow solar to be financially competitive, if you will, less so on the production manufacturing side of it. And I think if you look at the environmental practices of where we get our solar panels, which is predominantly China, if you look at the environmental practices of the Chinese Communist Party, and then you also look at their mining practices and their labor practices, I think that we're outsourcing the production of solar panels to a country that has poor environmental practices, that predominantly uses coal in order to generate the electricity needed for production of solar panels, and then also the mining elements. So I think that it's incumbent upon the United States, as part of our energy strategy, to look at how we can environmentally and soundly mine for rare earth elements here in the United States, which we do have, how we can mine for thorium for nuclear reactors. So that's also available to us. And then how we can produce solar panels in a way that's both cost effective, that's efficient, and allows us to compete with China in this sphere and arena. So I think that's a great question from the audience. And I think, diversifying our supply chain, if the pandemic taught us nothing else, it taught us that we need to diversify our supply chain away from the Chinese Communist Party, away from reliance upon China. That's especially true not only on energy production, but it's true in the pharmaceutical, antibiotic, and PPE or personal protective equipment space as well.
Just to put a finer point on that, appreciate your comments. Would you support certain policies to promote U.S. manufacturing? Would there be some other kind of incentive or some new structure or program to do that? Is that something that's actively being worked on right now?
I don't hear a lot of talk on that, but I'm not on the Energy and Commerce Committee. I have heard, I'm very concerned about programs or policies or discussions about limiting mining in the United States, limiting production in the United States. So I think whether it's grant programs, whether it's made in the USA, how do we tailor those programs so that it fits into the need to get manufacturing back here. There's sometimes when we have made in the US programs or made in America programs that there may be a component that can only come from one place, and then we end up hurting ourselves. So we have to look at this as an integrated strategy, because we also know that when it comes to the energy sphere, that there are international considerations that I think have to be addressed. So how we work together with other countries in order to help promote what we want to do in the United States to have energy independence, but also how we work with our other partners across the globe.
So keying off of that topic and making sure we work with others, there's a question that we have about the energy transition being both necessary and complex, and how do we then also work with other communities to ensure that there's an equitable access to these clean energy resources and that low-income communities aren't priced out of secure, reliable energy resources? How do you think about that question?
Well, I think it is tremendously concerning when we look about the cost of energy production. So when we look at low cost energy and how that impacts individuals, and trying to help communities that are disadvantaged, underprivileged, or communities of color, low income communities. So how do we deliver low cost energy there? So if we're on a pathway to do electricity generation from wind and solar, if tax credits are removed, are they equitable? Are they lower cost, inexpensive energy production? And then this goes into the broader question of our entire macro grid. So the macro grid, how do we get transmission lines? Who pays for those transmission lines? Is it the state who wants to have a carbon zero footprint, so they want to import, such as Iowa? We're a big wind producing state. It's always interesting to people, they don't think of Iowa as a wind. So we export energy or electricity. So who pays for that, and who pays for those transition lines? Is it the state that's receiving the energy, or is it the state that produces the energy? So I do think that there are a lot of conversations that we have not yet had on how do we equitably enhance, modernize our macro grid, our electric grid. Who pays for that, and how do we pay for that? Is it paid for like the interstate highway system, so we all benefit? And also that goes to self-generation. So we haven't talked a lot about distributed energy, but in places where individuals have solar panels, they have excess energy needs, they sell them back to the grid. Who pays for the lines, the transformers, and the poles? It has to be paid for by someone, and it has to be repaired. So if there's a natural disaster and lines are down, if the energy company is not charging for energy generation, then who pays for the repair of those lines and energy? So it really is a very convoluted conversation. It's complex, but it doesn't mean you shy away from having it. You have to have it and then introduce all these facets. So we come up with part of it, that's a small part of our overall national energy strategy.
I feel like somehow we've gotten 24 minutes into the conversation and haven't mentioned the infrastructure bill. So I'm not sure if that's a success or not, but I will bring it up now and just ask how you see those conversations evolving. Does that represent the forum in which we can have those discussions that you just mentioned around who pays for what? How are you thinking about this work stream and where it stands today?
You would think that in the overall energy infrastructure bill, or infrastructure, which includes energy. So when I think of infrastructure, I think roads, bridges, locks and dams. We do have locks and dams on the Mississippi, which are very important to both our manufacturing and our agricultural economy, not only in Iowa, but in the entire United States. But I also include broadband in that, and I have talked about our energy grid infrastructure. So you would think that that would be the place to have those discussions. But it's become a very political dynamic. And so I'm not privy to this discussions that have been held on the Senate side. On the House side, it's mostly been discussions about human infrastructure and how much they can pack into a bill. So we haven't had those conversations. But I also am not on Energy and Commerce, where a lot of these conversations may be taking place and I may be unaware of them. I try to read the minutes and the proceedings of the Energy and Commerce Committee, but it's hard when I'm on 4 other committees and 6 subcommittees to try to keep up with other committees. So these conversations may be taking place. I just haven't heard a lot of discussion about that.
Are there other things that you'd like to see included? If you had your druthers, is there something on your wish list that you really hope gets through here?
Roads, bridges, locks, and dams, I think, are typical infrastructure projects. But I do think broadband and then, a reliable energy grid infrastructure. So I think those components, most people would agree, are actual infrastructure and should be where our focus is. Doesn't mean we can't focus on the other things, but I think when we're talking about, and then how do we pay for those? So that's the other aspect that we haven't actually talked about. But if you know, in infrastructure, that's paid for out of the road use tax fund. There's a federal tax and then there's state tax. It's a tax that is based on our gasoline or our fuel tax. Those that drive diesel and large trucks pay higher percentage of that tax. So if we're going to be using that tax infrastructure or that tax revenue for infrastructure, then we have to be careful that it goes to where it was intended. And then if there's additional revenue that needs to be put in, then that goes into the mix. But how do we pay for it in an ongoing fashion? And that also leads to, how do we, have electric car charging stations? How do we charge for that? Who charges for that? Do we need some democratization of energy production and self-generation for energy production? And we've not yet had those conversations. I think certainly this forum is a way to start that and to make sure that it continues to go forward.
Great. So a couple of questions from the audience here related to workforce development again. So one of them is from Nicholas Fry. Thank you, Congresswoman. Reaching beyond solar or wind is a great thought. Geothermal is another opportunity to put oil and gas skills back to work in renewables. What is the congressional role for overseeing the promotion of these technologies that are only a degree of separation from our existing workforce? Do you have thoughts on that one?
That's a great question. And I apologize for not mentioning geothermal because I actually think about it, especially when you look at the diversity of the United States and what's available to us. And you can look at places like Iceland, who uses their own natural geothermal to produce electricity. And I didn't mention hydro. So two aspects of energy production that we have available that we don't talk a lot about, and they don't get a lot of press, but they certainly are renewable sources of energy. They have very little carbon footprint, and is something that should be more discussed. I know of businesses in Iowa that have used geothermal as an energy source, and there are other parts of our country where that could be a more valuable energy source. So thank you for the question. I do think it is an opportunity for individuals, but if we don't have people bringing it up to us, we continually talk about wind and solar. So thank you for bringing it up. Hydro and geothermal, very important as an all of the above energy strategy. I don't think there's one area that we should limit as we seek to have abundant energy, low cost, and energy independence.
Great. I will also say that Good Leap, yes, started in solar, but now finances geothermal heating for the home. Or really, I think the whole sector is evolving into these more holistic solutions and really meeting people's needs and decarbonizing through multiple means. We also have a job training platform I'll put out there called Next IQ. So any veterans involved with this event, I hope you'll reach out and can learn more about doing online training for some of these installation jobs. And on that same theme, another question comes from Matthew Myers saying, do you think that changes need to be made to veteran benefits to include funding for more advanced degree options and longer degree obtainment time spans, especially with the need for more future innovators? So changes to veteran benefits on that front.
So that's a great question. Recently, I had a bill that I'm looking at that is using GI benefits for other types of training rather than a 4-year degree. So whether or not your GI Bill benefits could be used for higher degrees. So for instance, I was in the old GI Bill benefits, so I was able to use my GI Bill benefits for medical school. So I was still in the reserve, so I had a part-time job and I had the reserve, so I did my weekly training and then my annual training, but then I also had my GI Bill benefits, and that was tremendously helpful to me in going through medical school. And so I think the same thing could apply, and in all likelihood, we would have to make some legislative changes to our GI Bill benefits to allow them, so long as you're within the time frame of your GI Bill benefits, that you could not use those for higher education. So great idea, and it may become a bill in the near future.
I have two last questions for you, Congresswoman. We are at the end of our time. Do you have a minute to stay?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Fantastic. So one question I wanted to bring up was how the energy transition will affect farming communities specifically. For example, in the lease of land for large-scale wind and solar projects, or even the production of biofuels, what kind of legislation can make sure that these communities are also benefiting and actively involved in the energy transition? I know this would be a big, topic in Iowa.
Well, certainly the ag community benefits from the leases. So leases for, a wind generation, they benefit from that, but also in the, the biofuels arena. So ethanol production, a lot of people think of ethanol, but the newest studies out of Harvard show how environmentally friendly farming and agriculture has become. It is not, unheard of to travel across the state of Iowa and to see solar panels at a farming community, because your input costs are your greatest cost. So also manure, to have people that have livestock production use manure for fertilize and energy generation. The other thing you see with ethanol is that you have dried distilled grains, which are part of the ethanol production, and those go into feeding livestock. So it's a higher protein form of livestock feed. There's a variety of ways in which the energy sector, and in more carbon neutral, if you will, energy sector helps the agricultural community and both benefit. Also, one of the things we're starting to look at, and there is some legislation on, and that's carbon credits for those in agriculture. As I mentioned, the newest studies have shown agriculture to be very environmentally sound. But looking at other ways for carbon credits, for crop production, cover crops that help with water quality. And then also, as I mentioned, looking at carbon capture and biochar as ways to improve the soil and also help reduce our carbon footprint, are ways that agriculture is going to benefit from more renewable sources of energy and cleaner energy environment.
Yeah, we talk a lot about technology. I think it gets a lot of headlines, a lot of focus. It's exciting, but there's also natural solutions to climate change and reducing our emissions. So important to keep part of the conversation. The last one is just to look a little more further ahead. When you look at where we're going in these energy discussions in America today, they're higher up on the priority list, it seems. What are the top priorities for you, and where do you see bipartisan action really happening and action happening, I guess, at all, if you were to go, say, a year or two down the line?
Well, what I would like to see is that we have an emphasis on conservation and how we use our land. I'd like to see us have, as we talked about earlier, a diversification of our energy sources. And that, as you had mentioned, when we're looking at how do we get low cost energy, that's an all above energy strategy. So making the United States continue to be competitive in the world, energy independent, and also economically viable. And that's going to take low cost energy production to be able to do that. We have an abundance of natural resources in the United States. We're very fortunate to have a country that can have mining for certain elements. We can have manufacturing production, agricultural production, wind, solar, hydropower, and geothermal, as you mentioned. So we're very fortunate that we actually have the full range and gamut. But the other thing that I don't want us to forget and take our eye off the ball is research and development. And I think we barely mentioned hydrogen fuel cells or hydrogen. And we didn't mention nuclear, and where nuclear can go with smaller reactors and with different types of material used within nuclear reactors. So I think it's important that we remember that research and development has to continue. Being a physician and in the science sphere, information is dynamic, it is not static. So what we see as problems today don't mean that the solutions have to come immediately, and they have to be a certain solution, because it's dynamic. This is ever changing. The more information and knowledge we have, that will grow upon itself. And what seems to be the most viable solution today, in 10 years, may seem archaic, and we may go, what were we thinking? So I'd like us to continue our research and development. And if we put too much emphasis in one field and we direct too much funding or preferential treatment to one area, then another area becomes subsumed and not researched, not developed. So I think you have to do both of those things. And we're a country that has solved tremendous problems, and I think that we can do both of those things at the same time. And then the third thing is that we need to be cognizant of whatever energy structure that we have, that it too has an environmental impact. And so we need to look forward and to say, what happens to solar panels? What happens to wind blades? How do we address that? So rather than waiting for it to be a problem, address it ahead of time, realize that it's an environmental issue and problem, and how do we address that now? And how do we put that as part of our energy package and our energy solutions? So I think these are all ways that I think can have a variety of job skills for veterans, from all the way from the most education in engineering to lesser education and technical education. And there's no one better to fulfill these jobs and get us to the point where we're continue to be energy independent, cleaner, and energy inexpensive, that allows our economy to grow, than veterans.
I'm hearing, it sounds simple. I know it's not easy, but hopefully what it all translates is to, as you alluded to there, more jobs for not only veterans, but people across the country, as all these opportunities continue to grow and evolve. And we'll leave it there. Congresswoman, thank you so much for your time. And thank you,
Julie. It's been a pleasure.
Fantastic. Thanks also to everyone listening to this important conversation during Veterans Advanced Energy Week. If you'd like to rewatch today's event or share the stream with a colleague, you can see a cached replay that will be available on the Atlantic Council's YouTube channel and across all their social media platforms. And now just a final note, coming up next in our program, join us for tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern for a panel discussion and networking session focused on veterans' careers in renewable energy, organized in partnership with DLA Piper. With that, thank you all again. Thank you to Congresswoman Miller-Meeks, and I hope to see you all at the event later this evening.